Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk a bit about the new book from Crossway called Scrolling Ourselves to Death, Reclaiming Life in a Digital Age. I'm going to take you through my typical format with a slight change. I have gotten some requests to talk a little bit about the writer or writers in this case of a book before I jump into the review, just to kind of position who the project is coming from. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the collection of authors in this case. Then I'll go through the main idea of the book, talk a little bit about the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then just my reaction at the end, just some like general takeaway thoughts. So let's jump into Scrolling Ourselves to Death. Also, this was published by Crossway. As I just mentioned, I want to say thank you to Crossway for sending me a review copy. This is my honest reaction to the book. Let's jump into it. So this is an essay collection. So it's a group of writers, and specifically, this is in a line of publishing from Crossway that's kind of known as the Gospel Coalition books. Like, it's literally called a Gospel Coalition series book. So it's a collection of writers that you'll typically see contribute to the Gospel Coalition website. I honestly don't follow the Gospel Coalition too closely, but I think that Crossway does a good job at keeping the quality of their publications pretty high, and so I do follow what Crossway puts out. And there were a few writers that I saw that contributed to this one that I have appreciated, and I was really intrigued by the connection to Neil Postman, which is something I'll talk about in the main idea. But the writers of this one, people like Colin Hansen, Jay Kim, Hans Maduame, Patrick Miller, Brett McCracken, notably. These are people that you'll see write for the Gospel Coalition somewhat regularly. So there were so that's who they are. The Gospel, they're coming from a pretty convinced Reformed perspective, but very thoughtful writers. And so they put together this essay collection riffing on Neil Postman's famous book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, but updating it, kind of reflecting on it and updating it for our current time in 2025. So that's who put this out. Now, that kind of links into the main idea a little bit. This is a clear and obvious reference to Neil Postman's 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's the 40th anniversary of do I do my math right? Yeah, 40th anniversary of that book this year. Hence, a lot of reflection on Neil Postman's influence. And this book is knowingly and clearly, even with citations and quotes, like directly pulling on Neil Postman's work in that title, referring to very specific proposals and ideas, and critiquing him a little in a few cases on some things he may not have been quite right about. But largely, the writers are very appreciative of Neil Postman's insights and feel like he was right about the big picture of where things were headed with technology and how it affected public discourse especially. And so they are reflecting on his writing, but also reflecting on the current age of social media, most notably social media and smartphone technology, and how that has kind of put a lot of Postman's concerns kind of on overdrive in our current time. And specifically this, I should say also this is obviously a Christian publication, and so there's a lot of explicit reflection on how does this affect Christian life, and also there's a good number of essays that reflect on Christian leadership, so it's kind of geared towards pastors, ministers, parachurch workers, people in leadership in church congregations, kind of to think carefully and critically about our current digital technologies and screens and how they're shaping our lives, really. So there's a lot of different angles that they reflect on. The book is set up into three broad kind of subject areas. The first whole section of essays is on reflecting on Postman's work and his insights. The second one is on practical challenges, specifically for Christian leaders, and then the third one is kind of more positive proposals about how Christian discipleship and formation can be a kind of counter witness to what we see happening in the digital technology. So, and there are 14 essays that go in lots of different themes around those three broad categories. So that's what the book is. The research behind it, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the research. This is not a research-driven book. The primary area of research is obviously Neil Postman. They do quote Neil Postman extensively, and not just Amusing Ourselves to Death, but also other work like Technopoly or interviews that he did. So it's very rooted in Neil Postman's work. There's some references to other current events that reach outside of just his writing, and some other similar writers too, like Marshall McLuhan, for example. But the research is not that. This book is not primarily a research academic project, but it is rooted really well. And as someone who's read some of Neil Postman, I think they represent him well, and I think that they even critique him fairly at points. And it's a good project rooted in his work, but it's not driven primarily by research. The readability of it is overall super accessible. I always, and I feel a little bit like a broken record when I review essay collections, but I kind of always come back to this with essay collections. They're always a bit uneven. There are just chapters that are more readable than others. None of them are overly stiff or dry. None of them are hard to understand, but some of them are just more enjoyable to read than others. Some are written by people who maybe are a little bit more used to academic writing as opposed to more accessible, accessible writing. So there's a range, but within that range, it's all skewed towards an approachable, readable format. And I do think that the reader gets a good introduction to some of Neil Postman's core ideas. I do not think you have to have read Neil Postman first by any means to appreciate this book. So yeah, overall readable and understandable. And then finally, my reaction to this. So I appreciated this book. I didn't love it, but I appreciated it. I liked it enough. I respect what they're doing in this book. There are a couple essays that stood out for me. Overall, I didn't feel like it dug in quite deep enough for what I would like in terms of a reflection on connecting Neil Postman's work to the smartphone saturated, social media saturated age. That said, I will highlight a couple essays that I really appreciated, and I'll comment on some of why I appreciated what they brought, so that you can maybe sense if this might be something you would like. Because, yeah, well, I'll say more about what you get as you read the book as a whole at the end. I'll say more about that in a moment. But one essay early in the book by Joe Carter is called From the Clock to the Smartphone, A Brief History of Belief-Changing Technologies. I really liked that essay. I would have loved that essay to be like 3 times longer because there's so much more he could have talked about. But thinking about how the invention of the clock, which was actually a monastic thing, how that technology shifted so profoundly cultural practice, and using that as a lens to think about more broadly how does technological change affect cultural reality in ways that are invisible or ways that we don't even choose. Sometimes it feels like the technology chooses the change for us and then we adapt to it unthinkingly. Really liked that essay a lot. Also Samuel James' essay, Striving for Seasonableness in a, quote, Now This World. That is one of the, I think they pull on Postman's insight about the whole now this, like the rapid kind of treadmill of news items that makes it really hard to engage in any depth on, like, you'll have a tragic news item next to a feel-good story, and that dilutes your ability to really wrestle with the heavy stuff. And that is one of Neil Postman's most prescient kind of insights that is just on wild adrenaline overdrive in social media news feeds. I mean, Postman, I don't know if he could have imagined the social media news feed, and it's just the now this on complete steroids. And so I thought, in general, the book, other essays reflect on the whole now this phenomenon thing, but that essay does a really good job with it. And in general, that's one of the things about Postman that this essay collection picks up on well, and I think applies it well to our current time. So I appreciated that essay a lot. I liked Colin Hansen's essay on how the medium shapes the message for preachers. As a preacher, that got me thinking and reflecting. I really appreciated Brett McCracken's essay on reconnecting information and action, how to stay sane in an overstimulated age. So like the intentional effort to reconnect doing something in response to just receiving this glut of information. The kind of the overload of information and the paralysis that comes from that is another thing Postman was concerned about. And again, that's on wild overdrive in our time. And so I think he did a good job reflecting on that in that essay. One of my favorite essays in the book was Jay Kim's essay, Clinging to Embodiment in a Virtual World. I just think it's a really good, positive, constructive proposal for how to think about embodiment in, and especially if you are a Christian leader or a minister, like leading a congregation or a community, thinking about the importance of in-person embodiment as a counter-witness to life in a digitally saturated time was really, really good. And then the final essay by Andrew Spencer, Heeding Huxley's Warning, was really interesting, kind of connecting Neil Postman and Aldous Huxley, and how Postman was more concerned that Huxley was the one who was predicting our future more than George Orwell. So there's some really that's more of a literary reflection, but really interesting stuff there. So yeah, out of those 14 essays, what did I just list? About 5 or so. Those were the standouts for me. They're all solid. There's no bad essays. They just range a little bit in enjoyableness to read and level of more penetrating insight. And the ones I just listed were ones that stuck with me more, jogged some of my reflection. So in total, like in response to this book, it's a level of thoughtfulness that I appreciate. Overall, the essays were shorter. This is always the issue with essay collections. I like monographs. I like books because you get deeper extended reflections. You don't get that here because these are essays. They are more like long articles or long articles you might read on a site like the Gospel Coalition. But they're thoughtful. They're respectful to Postman. The reader of this book gets a really decent sense of what Postman was doing in his work, and probably, I'm guessing, the reader, if you haven't read Neil Postman and you read this, you'll probably be inspired to read him, which is great. But overall, it's a little bit mixed. Solid, thoughtful, and worth some reading if you aren't interested in a deeper dive or maybe a harder to read monograph on technology. I think this is a really good intro to get some reflection going on it. So I'm glad I read it, even if I'm not gonna necessarily go back to it very very often. But I appreciate what they're doing in it. So those are my thoughts on Scrolling Ourselves to Death, published by Crossway and the Gospel Coalition writers. Thanks as always for taking some time to watch.